Hey there, and welcome to Solid Horror Reviews. I'm Solid Zaku, and today I'll be reviewing Creepshow. Now, before I begin, this video does contain spoilers and gory visuals from the movie. If you don't want any spoilers at all, or you're too squeamish about movie blood or gore, please turn away from the video now. You have been warned. With that said, let us begin. Creepshow is a 1982 anthology horror film that's directed by the late George A. Romero, screenplayed by the horror writing master Stephen King, and the master of splatter and gore Tom Savini does the special effects. This was sort of a dream project for Romero and King to do, since they've always wanted to do a horror movie together, and this film actually provided that chance. And boy, do they deliver on the goods through Romero's visuals and King's writing. The movie contains 5 separate stories that are contained within a short wraparound story, and they go as the following. The wraparound story covers an abusive and overbearing father punishing his son for reading trash comics, and the son getting revenge. The actual first story is called Father's Day, in which we're treated to a dark family story of an abusive father, I'm starting to see a trend here, who is killed by his daughter and comes back from the grave to get his Father's Day cake. The second story, called The Lonesome Death of Deverell, tells a sad story about a country bumpkin that burns his finger on a fallen meteorite. From there, the story grows. The third story, titled Something That Tied You Over, features a story about lovers' quarrel that gets drowned out by revenge. The fourth story, simply named The Crate, tells a dark story about 2 professors, one with an abusive wife whom he fantasizes he could kill, and the other a successful professor that gets dragged into a bloody and horrific situation with said crate. And our fifth and last story, They're Creeping Up on You, is about a hypochondriac Scrooge that gets his comeuppance from our 6-legged friends. Now, the first thing I really want to point out and gush about is the visuals and writing of the stories and the movie. Romero and King pays a lot of homage and respect to the 1950s EC comic books with Creepshow. Romero does his visuals by really focusing on filters and color lightings during shots to give strong red or blue hues that give this contrasty and almost pulpy look akin to horror comic books of that time. More obvious is also with the actual panel frames inserted into the film that blend in the comic and the real world together. Even without the comic book panel inserts, there are many scenes throughout the entire film that set up as if you had freeze framed them, or as the camera focuses on that shot, it feels like it could have been a shot straight from a comic book panel. King commits to his end by focusing on the macabre and campy aspects of each story. The lines that are written and the stories that are presented feel very much like those horror comic books of yesteryear. I would almost put them like campy horror movies to a point it feels appropriate with 1980s horror films. At this junction, I want to discuss about specific things of each story in the movie. The wraparound story features Tom Atkins as the abusive father, and surprisingly, Joe Hill, who's Stephen King's son, as the son Billy. Now, I've seen this movie like a dozen times, but I never really realized that the kid was actually Stephen King's son until I looked furthermore into the film's credits. Atkins does a great job playing a royal douchebag of a father, but man, does Joe Hill really have his moments of being a really seriously freaky kid. I mean, there's this one scene where he's just genuinely creepy. I love the appearance of Tom Savini and one of his special effects crew members at the end of the film as the garbage man. The eccentric banter that they have was actually pretty funny. And I love the quote, "You gotta chew your food before you swallow!" The Father's Day segment is probably the weakest story of the bunch, but by no means it doesn't deserve its place in the film. It sets up a great mood and expectation of what the rest of the film will be. By this, I mean it has a lot of the film's establishing usage of colored lighting and filters and really hits home with the comic book aesthetics. This segment does have the weakest death in the entire film, which involves Ed Harris. His character falls into a grave and he eventually unearths the dead body of the daughter. And as the tombstone keeps inching closer to smash his face in, he just lays there. Even when he sees the ghoulish father, he doesn't scream or try to get out or run. It's like a bad QTE moment in a video game and he just lets himself die. It's kind of funny now that I think about it. Lastly, the ghoulish zombie father makeup was a bit lacking when it came to close-ups. The face had this hokey look, with the mouth moving looking a bit awkward itself. You could pretty much see the fabric between the teeth. But from afar, the ghoul's getup actually looks pretty good. I also dig the scene when the ghoulish father rises from the grave. At certain shots and angles, it does look creepy. As for this segment, The Lonely Death of Joe Deverell, it features Stephen King as a title character. Not often do you see him take a main character role outside of his mere appearances in various movies. While King won't win any awards for his acting, he sure did a great job as Geordie. I love a lot of his facial expressions, or when he gets a bit cross-eyed. He really gives emphasis on his character and the cartoonish aspects. Speaking of that, this episode feels like a macabre Looney Tunes episode. Geordie is often very comical about his reactions and thoughts about things that just verge on the outrageous. As the meteor growth continues, I love how we get this proto-Grinch makeup with Stephen King. I know it's not the intent, but I found this actually kind of funny. Lastly, of course, King somehow had to place this story in, of all places, Maine, even giving reference to Castle Rock. If you're not familiar with King's works, oftentimes the settings of his stories take place in various towns in Maine, with Castle Rock being the most infamous of them all. It's a shame the story about Geordie isn't mentioned in any of his books. On the next segment, Something to Tide You Over, it's a delicious revenge story that's even made more delectable with Leslie Nielsen's acting. Now, when I first watched Creepshow, I was like around 12, 13 years old, and my familiarity with Leslie Nielsen has always been with his Naked Gun movies, Airplane, Dracula Dead and Loving It, and Spy Hard. So I had never really seen him do like a serious role and had typecasted him as a comedian myself. But I learned at a much later time in my life that Nelson actually started with serious roles in theater and film and eventually moved into comedy. Creepshow was my first foray with Nelson in a serious and dark role. And man, was Nelson rock solid as a villain. His delivery of each line was like a sting to Henry, played by Ted Danson. His expression belies his motive and actions to Henry and us the viewers. From his mannerisms to actions, Nelson stole every scene in this segment. I think my favorite scene with him was his genuine look of fear when he comes across the drowned zombies the first time. One last thing about this segment, I just kind of want to throw out there that Harry's Super Saiyan God underwater scene had me laughing as of the most recent watching. The fourth segment, The Crate, was the one segment that actually scared me when I was a kid. The first kill of Mike the janitor and later Charlie the college kid is what actually got to me. I think with that first kill, it was all about that tension building up with the eventual musical stinger and the dramatic red lighting and the quick shot of Fluffy, the monster, drove that jump scare really high for me. When watching these scenes nowadays, it's not a real definitive jump, but it's still creepy with the setup and the delivery. Now, if the first kill disappointed in the gore department for some of you, the second is made up with Charlie the college kid. Savini lets this guy have it with the practical special effects of Fluffy taking a chunk away from his arm and then that downward clawing of his face. Jesus, that was brutal. As for the last segment, They're Creeping Up on You, while The Crate scared me while watching the movie as a kid, this segment gave me nightmares for a few nights. Now, I'm not an epithemophobe, which is also known as having a fear of insects. I actually love insects. What actually got me was the last scene when Pratt was already dead from shock and had roaches just spewing out of his mouth and then later exploding from his throat. That freaked me out and gave me nightmares. It was just that kind of a death was horrifying to watch. Nowadays, it's kind of impressive to watch that practical effect come alive on screen. All in all, Creepshow is a wonderfully crafted film from Romero and King that pays great respect and homage to the 1950s EC horror comic books of yesteryear. The mastery in the cinematic visuals and the writing keeps you immersed in this horror comic book world from start to finish. Creepshow gets a solid 4 out of 5. While it's not a top-tier horror movie, Creepshow will always be a movie I highly recommend to any horror movie fan, old or new. Definitely check out Creepshow if you've not seen this. And that's my thoughts on Creepshow. But tell me, what do you think about my opinion or your thoughts on this movie? Leave a comment down below. If you enjoyed this video, Please like it, share it, and definitely subscribe to my channel. Make sure to click the bell button to get updates whenever I release new videos or reviews. Thanks again for watching this episode of Solid Horror Reviews, and until the next review, see you next time.